New wife saw no reason why her husband should be burdened, financially or otherwise, with 3 children who weren't his own. She was willing to take on the 2 children he had had by that marriage, although she wanted them sent away to boarding school. But she wanted nothing to do with the 3 children that had come into his previous marriage with Peter's mother. All Peter's stepfather was willing to do after that was pay for boarding school and then college, and an inadequate allowance. But he explained, somewhat sheepishly, that he could no longer offer them haven in his home, nor additional funds. After that, Peter's vacations were spent at school or at the homes of friends whom he managed to charm into taking him home. And he was very charming. Once his mother died, Peter learned to live by his wits. It was all he had, and worked well for him. The only love and nurturing he got in those years were from friends' parents. There were often little incidents when he stayed with friends during school holidays. Money disappeared. Tennis rackets vanished mysteriously and seemed to be missing when he left. Clothes were borrowed and never returned. Once a gold watch seemed to evaporate into thin air, and a sobbing maid was fired as a result. As it so happened, it was later discovered Peter had been sleeping with her. He was 16 at the time, and the proceeds from the watch that he had talked her into pilfering for him had kept him going for 6 months. His life was a constant struggle to come up with enough money to cover his needs, and he did whatever he had to do to meet those needs. He was so kind, polite, and pleasant to have around that he always appeared innocent when things went sour. It was impossible to believe that a boy like him could be guilty of any misdeed or crime. At one point, a school psychologist suggested that Peter had sociopathic tendencies, which even the headmaster found hard to believe. The psychologist had wisely surmised that under the veneer he appeared to have less of a conscience than he should, and the veneer was incredibly appealing. It was hard to know who Peter really was beneath the surface. Above all, he was a survivor. He was a charming, bright, good-looking kid who had had a bunch of rotten breaks in his life. He had no one to rely on but himself, and deep at his core, he had been wounded. His parents' deaths, his stepfather's distancing himself from him, and giving him almost no money. The 2 siblings he never saw once they were sent to different boarding schools on the East Coast had all taken a toll on him. And later, once in college, the news that his 18-year-old sister had drowned was yet another blow to a young soul already battered. He rarely talked about the experiences he'd had, or the sorrows that had resulted from them, and on the whole, he appeared to be a level-headed, optimistic, good-natured guy who could charm just about anyone, and often did. But life had been far from easy for him, although to look at him you'd never know it. There was no visible evidence of the agonies he'd been through. The scars were far deeper and well hidden. Women fell into his hands like fruit off trees, and men found him good company. He drank a lot in college, friends remembered later on, but he never seemed out of control, and wasn't. Not obviously, at least. The wounds on Peter's soul were deep and hidden. Peter Morgan was all about control, and he always had a plan. His stepfather lived up to his promise and sent him to Duke, and from there he got a full scholarship to Harvard Business School and graduated with an MBA. He had all the tools he needed, along with a fine mind, good looks, and some valuable connections he'd made in the elite schools he had attended. It seemed an absolute certainty that he was someone who would go far. There was no question in anyone's mind that Peter Morgan would succeed. He was a genius with money, or so it seemed, and he had a multitude of plans. He got a job on Wall Street when he graduated, in a brokerage firm, and it was 2 years after he graduated that things started to go wrong. He broke some rules, churned some accounts, borrowed a little money. Things got dicey for him for a while, and then, as usual, he landed on his feet. He went to work for an investment banking firm and appeared to be the golden boy of Wall Street for a brief time. He had everything it took to make a success of his life, except a family and a conscience. Peter always had a scheme and a plan to get to the finish line faster. He had learned one thing from his childhood. that life could fall apart in an instant, and he had to take care of himself. There were few, if any, lucky breaks in life, and whatever luck there was, you made yourself. At 29, he married Janet, a dazzling debutante, who happened to be the daughter of the head of the firm where he worked, and within 2 years, they had 2 adorable little girls. It was the perfect life. He loved his wife and was crazy about his kids. It looked like a long stretch of smooth road ahead of him finally, when for no reason anyone could fathom, things started to go wrong again. All he talked about was making a lot of money, and seemed obsessed with that idea, whatever it took. Some thought he was having too much fun. It was all too easy for him. He had fallen into a golden life, played too hard, got greedy, and inch by inch, he let life get out of control. In the end, his shortcuts and old habit of taking what he wanted did him in. He started cutting corners and making shaky deals. Nothing he could be fired for, but nothing his father-in-law wanted to tolerate either. Peter appeared to be on a fast track, heading for danger. Peter and his father-in-law had several serious talks while walking the grounds of his parents-in-law's estate in Connecticut, and Janet's father thought he had made the point. To put it simply, he had tried to point out to Peter that there was no such thing as a free lunch or an express train to success. He warned him that the kind of deals he was making and the sources he used would come back to haunt him one day, possibly even very soon. He lectured him about the importance of integrity, and felt sure that Peter would heed him. He liked him. In fact, all he succeeded in doing was making Peter feel anxious and pressured. At 31, first, for the fun of it, Peter started doing drugs. There was no real harm in it, he claimed. Everyone was doing them, and it made everything more amusing and exciting. Janet was worried sick about it. By 32, Peter Morgan was in big trouble, losing control over his drug habit, despite his protests to the contrary, and started running through his wife's money, until his father-in-law cut him off. A year later, he was asked to leave the firm, and his wife moved in with her parents, devastated and traumatized by the experiences she'd had at Peter's hands. He was never abusive to her, but he was constantly high on cocaine, and his life was completely out of control. It was then that her father discovered the debts he'd incurred, the money he'd discreetly embezzled from the firm, and given their relationship with him and the potential embarrassment to them and Janet, they covered his debts. He agreed to give Janet full custody of the girls, who were by then 2 and 3. He lost his visiting rights subsequently, over an incident involving him, 3 women, and a large stash of cocaine on a yacht off East Hampton. His children had been visiting him at the time. The nanny had called Janet on her cell phone from the boat, and Janet had threatened to call the Coast Guard on him. He got the nanny and the girls off the boat, and Janet wouldn't let him see them again. But by then, he had other problems. He had borrowed massive amounts of money to support his drug habit, and lost what money he had on high-risk investments in the commodities market. After that, no matter how good his credentials or how smart he was, he couldn't get a job. And just as his mother had before she died, he spiraled down. He was not only short of money, but addicted to drugs. 2 years after Janet left him, he tried to get a job with a well-known venture capital firm in San Francisco, and couldn't. He was in San Francisco by then anyway, and settled into selling cocaine instead. He was 35 years old and had half the world after him for bad debts, when he was arrested for possession of a massive amount of cocaine with intent to sell. He had been making a fortune at it, but owed 5 times as much when he was arrested, and had some frightening debts to some very dangerous people. As people who knew him said when they heard, he had had everything going for him, and managed to blow all of it to kingdom come. He was in debt for a fortune, in danger of being killed by the dealers who sold to him and the people behind the scenes who financed them when he was arrested. He had paid no one back. He didn't have the money to do it. Most of the time, in cases like that, when people went to prison, the debts were canceled, if not forgotten. In dire cases, people got killed in prison for them, or if